Welcome to AI Home Podcast, the first podcast for real estate resources and independent living strategies for the disability community. Why? Because accessibility is home. Hi, I'm Angela Fox, blogger, author, and your host. Now, let's begin. All right, everybody. Thank you again. This is Angela Fox. Accessibility is home. And as usual, I am in my handicapped bathroom because we know here at the podcast that accessibility at home is beyond the bathroom. Today's guest I have is Lleslie Davis. Lleslie, say hi to everybody.
Hi, everybody.
Lleslie is a world traveler, and she is going to talk about some of her experience overseas, and in particular, what she does here in the United States and how that gives her an opportunity to travel. But really, what I reached out to her was I heard that she was an architectural junkie. She also had some fabulous tips about a particular ramp that we'll probably talk at the end. Lleslie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks so much for having me. This is fun. So, I have a day job. I work at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. I am the assistant dean for international programs at the law school here. I work with the international agreements and partnerships and students at the law school. I also do disability coordination at the law school. And I've been doing this for 20 years. I started doing it in 2003. And then 3 years later, I became disabled. Like you, Angela, I have another one of those. Mine was Guillain-Barre syndrome that if anybody's heard of it, they might have heard of it in relation to vaccines or outbreaks of big viruses. Some older people I know who had Guillain-Barre syndrome had it as a result of the swine flu in the 1970s. And while COVID has not been that linked to Guillain-Barre, Zika virus has been. But honestly, it can be any virus. And it's an autoimmune response to a virus, whatever virus you want. Then your immune system attacks the myelin sheath around the nerves, and in some very severe cases, attacks the nerves themselves. And one hallmark of Guillain-Barre syndrome is ascending paralysis. So we finally figured out what was going on. And when I say finally, I mean over the course of 2 days, because it's really fast. I went from
Wow.
non-disabled to paralyzed over the course of 2 days. But first, I couldn't feel my toes.
Okay.
And then I couldn't move my feet. And then as I'm sitting in the area of the ER, also in terrible pain because your body
Sorry.
destroying your nerves actually really hurts.
I bet that tickles, right?
Uh,
Tickles a little bit.
no, it feels like somebody's
Yeah.
murdering you.
Oh,
And yeah, so the ascending paralysis was the key. And then the good thing is that then there's descending non-paralysis. Again, this is the severe cases where people are paralyzed at all. I was paralyzed, had to be on a ventilator because my chest muscles wouldn't be able to work and I
yeah.
wouldn't be able to breathe. But most people who get syndrome,
Mhm.
they notice weakness in their peripheral, in their hands, their feet, and or paralysis. And then my situation is my nerves regenerated, except from my elbows down and my knees down, the regeneration was only partial. So I have what is affectionately called ape hand, where my thumbs don't oppose, and I have foot drop, so I can't pick up my feet. So it's a weird thing. It's in some ways it's like a spinal cord injury. In some ways
Yeah.
it's like MS. So I get to draw from knowledge about all of those things to deal with my particular disability.
Oh, I'm sorry that happened to you. It sounds like for those 2 days could have been life threatening. But how has that changed your traveling?
Yes, I used to travel a lot for my job, and then this happened in 2006. And I think it wasn't until 2009 when I first traveled outside of a car. And then I haven't looked back since. And it's those of you with disabilities will get this. Like there are unique and interesting things about disability that in a strange way make life more interesting. And for me, in many ways, more fulfilling because I can
Hmm.
totally geek out now about all kinds of things that I never knew I'd be interested in.
Or I had a need for it. I mean,
Like,
I always tell people if I was not born with my disability, my everything would be different. My
yeah,
focus, I probably wouldn't be a lawyer. There's just so many things. I would start this podcast and meet you.
right.
So I totally yes, your world changes, but it's not necessarily in a always a bad way. You
Exactly.
find expertise and knowledge other people may need when they're 80, but you have it like for me at 16. I tell
Right.
people I can't wait to grow old because I have learned so much about how to deal with only half my body working because I have complete paralysis. And that when I turn 65, I no longer have to have a doctor's note to get any of those services or accommodations. It's just now in the United States, at least, oh, you're senior citizen. I can't wait until I'm 60. I'm
I
totally
know.
looking
Wait,
forward.
I have the privilege of teaching older people than myself about accessibility and mobility aids. But back to your other question, there are things besides the traveling.
Hmm.
Also, I'm the chairperson of our city's Council for Community Accessibility. And we do all manner of things. But one of the things we do is we do accessibility audits of places, mostly businesses, but we've also done polling places. We've done all the schools in town. A colleague of mine and I at the city are both certified ADA coordinators. But what's most fun is like getting to go into my favorite restaurants and coffee shops and saying, okay, you're close, but you know what else you need to do? And as part of this community, we get good buy in. We have people reaching out to us saying, we really want to be accessible or at least as accessible as possible. Can you
Hmm.
come help us figure out what to do? And so we love that. The other thing that some of us have started is what we call the mall. The mall stands for the Mobility Aids Lending Library.
Okay.
And our mutual friend Karen is involved in
Yep.
this.
Yep.
And basically, this started with my neighbor, another wheelchair user with MS, and I,
Hmm.
because both of us are such like tech geeks and junkies, and we're just like, what wheelchair would be better for me now? What
Yeah.
other device would be better for me now? And can I afford it or get it somehow? But either it outlived its usefulness or it was not as great as we thought.
Hmm.
And there it is in the basement or in the garage. And we each had experience giving old wheelchairs to other people who needed them and didn't have quick access to them. And so now we are basically like a matchmaking service between people who have mobility devices that are no longer needed and people who need them.
Yeah, a lot of states, not every state. And just for the audience awareness, while I may live in Maryland, I actually grew up in Indiana, northern Indiana, my whole life. Most of my education came from Indiana State University, not IU. But so not every state has this. But I do try to recommend people look into the state's assistive technology office, which is
Mhm.
hopefully housed in a disability office and not the senior and aging, but sometimes it's located there too. And a lot
Yes.
of assisted technology offices will have these technology loans, not just loans for money, but also equipment. And over the years and decades, Assistive technology has also now included wheelchairs, specific beds that you might need for your house, or a ramp that you can use, a portable ramp that you can use. And so there are actually things that you could get loaned or even given for free that you can use within your house. If you look in your state's office, assistive technology office. But there's all kinds of independent, like the mall that you just mentioned. On Facebook, there's a million different Facebook groups that are, trying to sell equipment by disabled people or just for free. If you're new to the disability community, look into that and don't automatically think that you necessarily have to buy something brand new. If Facebook thinks it's medical equipment, they will not let you sell it for liability reasons.
No way. I didn't.
Yeah, so I was trying to sell my extra travel wheelchair that got slightly damaged from my airline, and sure enough, I could not post it on Facebook and to make up a fake description and just had the photo. And most of these disability equipment Facebook groups, they gave me that tip. It's not false advertising. People, if you're in it, that's what's going on. So when the description doesn't match the photo, it's a workaround with Facebook.
Oh, thank you for that tip.
You're welcome. And wait, here's a fun fact since we're talking about traveling. The Department of Transportation just put out the final guidelines for accessible bathrooms on airplanes.
I heard.
So,
Sadly, it's all airplanes built something like
yeah, I
10
know.
years from now.
Yeah. But
But
that's a good segue about how tiny when things are built for like housing and things like that. That really makes a big difference on when things accessible. And I know you have had some experience overseas. Would you like to
yeah,
talk to the audience about that?
I travel a lot to Asia, but also to Europe. And I've got a history of and relatives in Hungary where I go a lot and to the European Union countries. And these are all very old cities. Those of us who've been to New York and Boston and Chicago, for example, yeah, where the buildings were built so long before the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed 33 years ago, that existing buildings, while the ADA covers them, the ADA doesn't mandate, and there's no ADA police. It doesn't mandate that you have to destroy that one step that's in front of your building to get into it. If you're changing the entrance, that's another story. But in Europe, there are generally very few rules governing existing structures. I roll around Budapest, and every place I might want to go in almost has just one step. And what's interesting is that most people in Europe, and probably most people in the United States too, I have to say, they think that just one step is accessible. And Europe is so far behind when it comes to the accessibility of the built environment, in large part because everything is so old. Nothing was designed to be accessible back in the day because you know what? You had to worry about floods, you had to worry about mud, you had to worry about horses and their droppings, and all kinds of reasons why people might have wanted to live higher than street level. I get it. I get it. Most of those things, climate change notwithstanding, but most of those things aren't the issue anymore. But it is very hard to get old countries to suddenly say, oh, yeah, sure, we're on board with that. We will modify all of our buildings. No problem. What they hide behind is, in my opinion, is everybody will say it's a historic building. We couldn't possibly change it.
And that's funny because we have that problem here in the United States. Our houses and buildings are not nearly as old. But one thing I tell people when they're looking into buying a home and you're disabled, or you're conscious about having aging in place, that you do not want to buy a historical home because of these issues.
The law I was telling you about in Hungary, so there's very little in the law about specifically mentioning existing construction, but except of course historic preservation. But new construction, it is assumed in most European cities at least that you're not building a single family home, you're building a building that has units in it. And I think it's since 2005, new buildings need to be barrier free. And if they have more than 2 stories, which in European standards, that would be like 3 stories because they don't call the place where you enter the first floor, they call it the ground floor, then it must also have an elevator. But I learned from my good friend who does disability law stuff in Hungary, he just bought a new single family house on the outskirts of Budapest. So where they actually do have some standalone houses, and the nobody way that a new single family home would be exempted from this. So he said, yeah, it's a barrier free entrance. And because it's not more than it has 2 stories in our
Okay.
parlance rather than 2 stories in the Hungarian sense. It doesn't have an elevator. And he was apologetic that it didn't have an elevator. And I said, no, the fact that your house by law had to have no steps, that's where I'm impressed because we don't, you know,
We don't have that.
can you
We
imagine
don't have
telling
that.
Americans you have to build all of your houses now without steps? Can you imagine
Yeah.
the uproar?
Yeah. There's 2 things I think we want to glean from this. And that is, one, is ironic that Hungary technically has a law that requires new construction to be barrier free or zero entryway, as we call it in the United States. While in United States, I know we keep saying this, we don't have that. We don't have that as a requirement for single family homes. And it's also interesting that Hungarian, as you just mentioned, there's so many old buildings, they didn't really expect to have a lot of new construction. And so they didn't really put a lot of thought behind it, probably because of that. Oh, yeah, we'll probably just put that in. And the chances of that being an issue is like once in a blue moon, right?
Right.
But yet in the United States, we have the land. Here in the United States, we have tons of land. We are not on top of each other. We have land that hasn't even had any buildings on it, and we are constantly building new homes. And yet we don't have that law. That's interesting that that has occurred. I think it's also interesting in vagueness can actually be your friend in the structure language of the law. And one thing that I always advocate and I tell people, it's actually a very interesting time right now for the disability community as far as making private sector housing, home ownership accessible. Not because we have the law, but because we don't.
Mhm.
So what I tell people is if you want to hire a contractor to make your house accessible, the only framework they'll have is the ADA guidelines. All right. That's all they'll have. Or they might have some sort of Fair Housing Act stuff. But building code. And so will make an assumption that they have to apply that to your personal house. And unless your zoning and your county code has something specifically for private sector housing, that doesn't apply. So
Mhm.
that means you can do whatever you want for your home and you can really monetize it or structure it in a way that meets your specific needs because we don't have the law. And there are
Exactly.
many different organizations right now that are trying to address this and say, okay, this is what the ADA has, but that's not good enough. And since there's no law, we're going to make up our own guidelines, and we're
Yep.
going to publish it. And I have it on my website. And so now it's only a voluntary basis.
I, there's something I've been running into that reminds me of exactly this. I wouldn't trade having the ADA for the world. But
Right.
that being said, when I work in other countries, I realize that it is possible to do things that by ADA standards wouldn't strictly meet the letter of the law, but it can make a place accessible for a large number of people. So I don't know if anybody has seen this German woman who calls herself the Lego Grandma. You've seen her, Angela?
I've read about it. I would love to get a hold of her, have her on this podcast.
I can put you in touch. She's not an
Really?
English speaker, but she uses DeepL translation, and all of her English language emails are perfect. But
Okay.
she's a wheelchair user. I can't remember why. I think she's in her 60s, perhaps early 70s. She lives in a small town in Germany, not far from Stuttgart. And all the houses, all the shops, they've got one step. And so she started building ramps made out of Legos. And they are customized for the person who lives in the house or for the business. The candy shop has like one of the Haribo bears on it. They're adorable. And they don't try to bridge more than one step generally. And in some cases, it's not one solid piece, but two pieces, like those ramps
A
that are
rail.
always a little scary to use because you have to make sure your wheels are exactly where they should be. And the thing is, that means that she and many other people with wheelchairs, and that all the other people benefit from all the other kinds of wheel devices.
Mm-hmm.
The majority of people can access those places versus not being able to access them at all. And none of them, to my eye, look dangerously scary. But of course, that is all a very subjective thing.
Right.
But none of them are 1 to 12. They aren't. They just aren't. And maybe some of them are 1 to 8, which the ADA says you can do for a short stretch. The problem is, and I've been trying to get some of these built in my city. And the problem is that even if it's a temporary ramp, I've got the okay for us to do it, but it
Okay.
must meet the minimum, which is 1 to 8 in special circumstances. There just aren't enough Legos for 1 to 8. There really aren't, unless you've just got like a 3-inch step. So this is problematic. But Canada recently passed
Oh,
a
really?
nationwide disability law. I don't know how
Okay.
recently, but
Okay.
I thought there was one. It's the Canadians with Disabilities Act, but I
Okay.
thought that had been in place for a lot longer than it has, because having visited British Columbia, they are doing a great job. But I only recently learned that accessibility was a province by province thing and was not a national thing until recently. But the longer you wait, the more built up you get, the harder it is to enforce retroactive disability legislation. But in Canada, there's this great nonprofit organization called Stopgap, very similar to the Lego ramps. They build and paint very colorfully wooden ramps, essentially wooden wedges.
Okay.
Uh, And I don't think they're 1 to 8 either necessarily,
Mm.
but the Canadians with Disabilities Act is not so stringent that they can't use them. And the key is that they are temporary. So you have to put them down and take them up. And somebody has to be trained to use them. And there are liability waivers. But it allows them just enough more flexibility that they, for example, could do Lego ramps in places where we can't.
I love the idea of Lego ramps because it's something that the disability community can make themselves. One thing that I've been trying to research, so if anybody's listening, I know that having 3D printers are all the rave, and I'm always looking for somebody that, who is disabled that has built through a 3D printer, ramps or anything that you can use within the home. And there really hasn't been as far as I've seen a few things, but if anybody's listening and you want to be on the podcast to talk about that's great. But I really like the idea that we can do that ourselves. And it's fun and it's playful to be able to do. Now, I know, and here's a fun, interesting fact, is that the standards for the ADA really were from a previous standard that was not national. And I
Mhm.
won't spoil it because you have to listen to my episodes. But the drivers behind them were really men who were disabled. As a result of that, these inclines are not really gender neutral because we do know that there can be a difference as far as the strength that makes there are differences between strength of women and men. But these standards were really designed from a man's perspective. There's always been this discussion that maybe the ADA needs to have more flexibility either way for that because it
Right.
was really just focused on one gender. But that's just a little side note digress, but that's really important for inclusion of different people when you're making these laws because sometimes you make it good for one and not the other, right?
Yep. And it is hard to be all things to all people.
Now, I know that you use a special ramp yourself
Oh,
and
I
you
do.
have your a few other resources.
Yeah. So I was on a quest, and this is as a result of spending time in Europe, but also in older US cities, just the problem of the one step. And the fact that a lot of the places I go, I am going alone. And whatever I'm carrying, especially if I'm traveling and I've got to carry luggage, I've got to carry it myself. And so I was on the hunt. For years, I've been on the hunt for a portable ramp that didn't weigh 100 pounds, that was actually manageable. And none of the stuff I saw on Amazon or on easy access ramps, or there are lots of great sources for ramps if you're going to install them. But I can't even begin to tell you like the rabbit holes I went down and WhatsApp chats I was having with people in Singapore before I finally got
Wow.
connected to a company that distributes a ramp made in Japan by the Dunlop company, Dunlop of like tennis balls and tires. This Dunlop ramp is made of fiberglass reinforced with carbon fiber, which means it's super light and it comes in a variety of lengths. The one that I have is 27 inches, so a little over 2 feet. There's actually even a shorter one that I cannot get my hands on in the United States yet. But the one I have is a bifold ramp. I can put it behind my back in my wheelchair, or my travel wheelchair has this cargo net I have fixed to the back, and I can put it in there. I can lift it with one finger or two fingers. It weighs 7 pounds, which it is actually more than I thought it weighed because it literally seems so light. And I will deploy it to get into a shop, to get into an apartment with one step. If I find myself on one of those sidewalks with no way to get off, I will use it there. I will use it in a pinch if the accessible metro or trolley or what have you isn't accessible at that stop.
Mm.
So let me just put a shout out. It is distributed in the United States and worldwide by a company called Goldman, Guldmann. It's a Danish company. And the line is called Stepless. In the US, they have offices in Florida, maybe it's Miami, and in Boston. Also on my website, which is called Everybody in International, under the resources tab, it gives you the contact information. And if you tell them I sent you, you'll get a 20% discount on the ramp.
That's what we need.
And they aren't cheap. That's what I got to say. They are not
Mhm.
cheap. And the 20% discount was useful. And then I decided that for my line of work and for what I do, it means that I can say, okay, yeah, I can stay in that place because
Yeah.
I can negotiate that step now.
Yeah.
They make them all the way up to a little over 6 feet, which is 21 pounds for a 6 foot ramp. Can you imagine?
No, I have my book on how to approach buying and modifying a home, which includes working with real estate agents and how to research and everything. I do have a resource section, and I have the Amazon, what they call suitcase metal ramp that I have in the back of my van, but that's still bloody heavy. I could pick it up on my own, but I rely on my wheelchair by putting it on my
Yep.
foot pedal. That's insane how light that is.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
One thing I want to just quickly circle back, when it comes to like historical buildings, because again, we have that issue here in the United States if you buy a home that is historical. How do you address people when they say you're going to destroy the historicalness of that building?
Mhm. I know we run into this in the United States, but it's usually where people more likely are people are saying, oh, we're grandfathered in, which we know isn't actually a thing. But I honestly think the US is a bit better about this when it comes to places on the historic register. And to the extent that those are overseen by the National Park Service, there is a whole manual on how to make those buildings accessible to visitors. And this is the point I try to make with people who will say, oh, we can't possibly, because they're often not actually the ones defending the building. They're saying, here's why we're not accessible. It's not our fault. It's the historic preservation. It's the historic heritage, etc. And then I will show them things. I will show them products like this same company, this Goldman, makes something that is called a platform lift and they are using this in churches. I've seen it in some cathedrals in England, which actually the UK is quite a bit further advanced than a lot of Europe in this area. It basically looks just like the marble floor leading up to the marble steps, but it's bounded by like a brass border, and there's a little button somewhere. You roll onto that, you push the button, and this section of marble floor lifts up and brings you level with the altar or whatever it is if it's in a church. But my point is, if you care about historic preservation, then you know that you have to have people who appreciate historic buildings, are willing to keep them up, are willing to divert government funding to their upkeep. And if you have an aging population and an increasingly disabled population, or population of people who have gone to war and are
Mhm.
coming back with disabilities, you are missing out on a huge subset of the population. Disabled people are the world's largest minority.
Mhm.
You are missing out on their support. I frankly find it so insulting for somebody to say we couldn't possibly put a ramp because what, it would be ugly.
This idea that you're somehow changing it and therefore it's no longer historic as well. But historic is a relative term
Yeah.
because meaning, yeah, you want to keep things as intact as they were, but things fall apart. And when you are trying to fix it, you are using somewhat modern materials. You're not using the exact same materials, let's just say the exact same materials that originally built that building. They don't usually exist. So you're doing replicas, right? You're doing things that look like they belong there. But the point is that you're always changing. And it may seem odd to be talk about this in a disability home ownership podcast, but just in my city in Rockville, there is the old Rockville. And a lot of these big mansion homes, which are very expensive, $1 million, they are privately owned, but they are under the Historical Society list. And so if you buy these homes, you have to sign that you have to get permission to change a few things. So imagine if you become disabled when you buy later in life after you bought this home, or if you have family or friends that you want to come that are disabled. So there is this problem with disability home ownership. But at the end of the day, what you just said about having that marble level ramp to get into churches, what we're really talking about is, does it look like it belongs? Does it
Uh-huh.
look nice? It doesn't look like it belongs. That's what
And
we're really talking about.
and
And what's really interesting about that is you also have that same concept when you're dealing with HOAs.
yeah.
All right. HOAs,
Uh-huh.
while there is some language in the Fair Housing Act, you still have to go through their reasonable accommodation exception and go through them. And a lot of things that the HOAs are requiring are not necessarily safety issues, they're cosmetic. Do we all look the same? And so that's the same kind of background that you have with historical buildings and historical homes. So at the end of the day, it's about, does it look like it belongs there, and is it pretty?
And you can take that a step further by saying, does it look like it belongs? If the answer is no, it means that I don't look like I belong.
Thank you.
And
Yes.
that is blatant housing discrimination.
I actually did an episode about how HOAs really came from a segregation.
Oh, yeah.
I talked about how it dramatically has impacted Black disabled homeowners in
Mhm.
HOA gated community or other similar gated communities. So it's still much of a problem. You're right. It's, do we belong? Do we belong there? What we need to get into things is a matter of, do we really belong there? You're absolutely right.
Have you told your listeners before about that Greek temple?
Thank you. No, I have not.
It's
Thank you so
beautiful.
much, Leslie. I would love to do that. So Leslie and I talked a little bit about her travels and everything. And one thing that I ran across is, there was an article. It was from an archaeological site on disabilities, and they found a temple in Greek during the Greek gods, and they found a actual ramp that was built for this particular goddess. And the reason why was that particular god in Greek and Roman times was to heal. And back then, they have enough forethought to think, well, if this God is about healing people and people need to get into to make sacrifice to be healed, maybe the people coming have mobility difficulties. And therefore, we're going to build, not with steps like all the other gods, we're going to build a ramp. Now, that was several thousand years ago, ladies and gentlemen, and they thought about, I don't understand why in modern times we're not thinking about that in a similar way. Thank you, Leslie, for bringing it up. Everybody, if you're getting pushback about this is such a new concept or only been around for 2, 3 decades, no, it hasn't. No, I'll try to find the article or put up in a blog post, because the Greek, okay, the Greeks thought about it. Maybe not as expensive as we are thinking about it today, but they thought about it even back. So ramps have been around since civilization, literally since civilization. So thank you, Leslie, for reminding me that fun. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, Leslie and I. And please stay tuned for how to follow up.
Thank you.
HorizontalHouses.com is the hub for all things related to disability home ownership. You will find my blog, this podcast, my book, and how my consulting services can help real estate agents or housing developers market and tap into the largest minority group, the disability community. Please help me continue this exploration of disability home ownership by connecting through my Facebook page. Remember, sharing our collective experiences will allow us each to lower the kitchen sink, but raise the bar for disability home ownership. Thank you.